The situation of Wagner's first three operas is in some ways unique, especially as a musician unique. I had a composition teacher when I was at Juilliard, composer Roger Sessions, who's one of America's great composers, and composer of 12-tone music. I mean, a modern composer who died maybe 20 years ago. And he knew Wagner's music very well. Actually, he did a doctoral, he supervised a doctoral dissertation on one motif for Wagner for a student, a composition student who did this for very technical plays. And so he really was very, very knowledgeable, and he had very strong opinions about certain aspects of Wagner's works. And he said something that really stuck with me. He said that there is no comparable leap in terms of both quality and quantity, as it were, not just in terms of how good something is, but what it is, as in the creative works of any artist in any discipline, in any time in Western civilization, such as the leap that Wagner makes between Rienzi and Flying Dutchman in a period of 1 year, and really less than 1 year, because it's probably almost overlap in combinations. So the overriding theme that I'm going to talk about today and tomorrow is on what happened. How does he make this leap? Now, of course, that's something we can't entirely answer, but we can at least look and see what the leap is to some extent and what causes it. Now, let's talk a little bit about the musical world of Wagner's upbringing and the world in which Wagner sort of comes to life. One of the things that I think, just thinking now about, which is, I think, helpful in trying to understand where Wagner is in 1835, 1840 as a young man, in the musical sense, is to compare him with Verdi. We were talking about Oberto, Verdi's first opera. It's probably no better than Die Fame. And Giorno di Regno is probably no better than Liebesverbot. Certainly not, I'd say. And whether or not Nabucco is better than Rienzi is perhaps, it might be because it's twice as short. It has indisputably that advantage. But there's an enormous, and almost infathomable difference between Wagner and Verdi's development. Verdi grew up in the midst of a very constant and continuous cultural tradition, in a world in which opera was the main means of musical expression, also one of the main means of theatrical expression, in which opera had a very strong set of well-established conventions that were always in evolution, but nevertheless which were universally accepted. Verdi was not someone who had any particular interest in, or would have ever occurred as a young man, to think about throwing over these conventions, nor throwing over the basic concept of what was the role of opera in society. It was a kind of entertainment. It was a kind of glorified entertainment. It was entertainment, it was sport, it was very much what it still is in a certain segment of Italian society. Sort of a cross between bullfighting, soccer, and Tristan. Sort of a little bit for everybody. Perhaps not so different in some ways for what Shakespeare was to Elizabethan society, after all. In other words, many, many different levels of appreciation and understanding. Verdi grew up, got a job basically in the theater, got commissioned, the very first opera by the biggest theater in Italy, La Scala, and wrote an opera every year, or 2 operas a year, for the next 30 years. Well, the next 18 years, basically. And undergoes a kind of gradual, continuous growth and evolution of style and maturation, and gets better and better. Now, it doesn't go in a straight line. It never does with artists. He has a very questionable period when he writes operas like Corsaro and Attila and Alzira, which he was very unhappy with. But basically, Verdi was always working, was always successful. Not every opera was a success. He had some fiascos, but he was basically a hard-working, successful person growing up in a well-established tradition. He knew exactly what the world in which he was working, and he knew exactly what he was expected to do. He was in the midst of the whole thing all the time, and grew outgrew everybody else, of course, outdid everyone else, and transformed the discipline in which he was working, but nevertheless grew up absolutely in this discipline. Not so differently, although over a much longer span, than a composer like Mozart, who also grew up in a world where opera had a certain place. In Mozart's world, there were two different kinds of opera, and they had two different kinds of place. There was Italian opera, and there was German opera, which was a light entertainment called Singspiel, which had some spoken dialect, spoken dialogue, and which was a different kind of entertainment. Now Mozart, of course, completely transforms these, but he does so because he's just so much better than everybody else was. He doesn't transform them because he undergoes any enormous change of technique or even of conception, but rather just because he transforms them just by quality. Yes, he absorbs a huge lot of other influences. He completely, totally, and forever radically changes the relationship between the composer and the librettist with his relationship with the composer. But the fact is that that's not a sine qua non for the importance of Mozart's later works, because the libretto of Zauberflöte, my Schickenator, is pretty much like any number of other Singspiel librettos from that period. I mean, it has certain characteristics of political and social importance, but it's not so different. So it wasn't just because Mozart shacked up with I don't want to start spreading rumors about Mozart. He got together with De Ponte, who was light years greater than any other librettist, or light years more important dramatist and writer than any other librettist had been before him. This is just to show that composers usually grow up in a tradition. Beethoven, as a young man, grew up very much in tradition. He worked for 7 years as principal violist in the orchestra in Bonn, playing operas. We know exactly what operas he played. And he came to Vienna to study with Haydn. He'd already written dozens of pieces, all of which he either destroyed or tried to destroy, when he realized how good the competition was, as it were. But the point is that these are people who grew up in a very well-established tradition, had a very clear idea of what they were trying to do and how they were going to do it. Wagner is very, very different. Now, in one reason it's different is because Wagner came to music so late. You know, Wagner really didn't start studying music seriously until he's 16 or 17 years old, and didn't write anything that we know about musically until he's 20 years old. Most composers, I mean, let's forget Mozart and Schubert or Mendelssohn, but most composers by the age of 20 have written a lot of music. Maybe not music that they keep or music that's performed, but they've written a lot of music. In some cases, really hundreds of pieces. He came to music very, very late. And in an extremely disorganized fashion. And then he makes this decision, which I think leads to a little bit of a misconception about the nature of the first 3 operas, but I'll get there in a second, that he wants to write operas. He wants to be a composer, and he wants to write opera. But I think there is another, much more fundamental difference than the sort of haphazard quality of Wagner's musical education and the fact that he came to opera so late. That is a very, very key factor in the let's say, very mixed quality of his apprenticeship works and of the seeming lack of direction that they have. What is the state of opera outside of Italy from the 1790s and 1800? I think the real problem is, what is the state of music outside of Italy? Who is the towering figure that dominates all musical thought in life outside of Italy, and even in Italy? We're talking about music per se. Anybody in this room can tell me who it is. Who is it? Who is the person who in 1820 or 1830 or 1840 is universally thought of as the composer, who has completely changed the whole landscape of music? Beethoven, exactly. For Verdi too, by the way. Verdi considered at age 20 Beethoven to be overwhelmingly the greatest composer. He just had the good sense not to use him as a model. He was working within his own framework, and he couldn't have thought of a way to use Beethoven to change the way he was writing operas. So if he did so in ways that, but for everybody, Beethoven was this dividing line. And Beethoven had radically changed music, or been the climactic point in radical changes of music, but not of operatic music. Beethoven wrote one opera, Fidelio, which is enormously important, but very not so much important as an opera for what it is, or for what it isn't. Fidelio was not a success in Beethoven's lifetime. He revised it over and over again. It was originally 3 acts and he turned it to 2. There's 4 different overtures, as you probably know, because he was trying to find a formula that would work better. He was also unlucky with Fidelio because it was premiered during the French occupation of Vienna, so there was no natural audience for a German opera with German dialogue. But the problem with Fidelio as an opera is that the music is much too good for the text. That the music sort of sits on the text and on the story in a very kind of uncomfortable fashion. That there was no tradition. There had been this line of tradition of opera in France, which has pretty much died out. It seemed to have died out in Beethoven. If we're talking about the year like 1800, but then there was something that did happen, which I'll get to in 1 second. And then there was this Italian tradition, which was pretty much constant. Which, with Rossini, Donizetti, Verdi, this is sort of a constant flow. So Italy has this world. But in Germany, there had been a tradition of sort of light entertainment, Singspiel, sometimes which was closer to what we would think of as almost like acted out oratorio. I mean, the theatrical element was very unsophisticated and undeveloped. But it's not really thought. For instance, it would be impossible for almost any musician to name a single German opera not written by Mozart or close contemporary Mozart. Between, let's say, the death of Mozart and the Beethoven's Fidelio. Now, higher-end operas, but higher-end operas within the Italian tradition, with Italian texts, and for Italian opera theater, very consciously as Italian opera works. And they don't seem typically of Haydn. So there's sort of this vacuum within the world of German opera. There's really nothing going on. The music is developing enormously, but the opera world is not. Now, there were composers who were writing operas not Italian opera style, who were making developments in opera at the time of Beethoven, and these were the ones that Wagner first knew. Now, of course, we've already talked about Carl Maria von Weber. Now, Carl Maria von Weber is a very, very important figure for Wagner, and one who certainly influenced Wagner, especially in Ethan, and one whom Wagner in some ways probably wanted to emulate. But there are certain aspects of Weber which make him a very imperfect and very incomplete model for Wagner. And I would argue that much less influential on Wagner's work than Wagner himself would let us think. Simon already said this, but I'm going to say this much stronger. Wagner is a terrible source for understanding of his own works, especially in Mein Leben, which is written almost with very clear historical perspective in mind. He is rewriting history very self-consciously. None of us can effectively write about something that happened 30 years ago in any case, because we are unconsciously affected or influenced by the present. But he very consciously changed it. When we talk about Flying Dutchman tomorrow, his descriptions of Flying Dutchman bear almost no resemblance to fact. And they were purposely changed to fit an agenda, which suited his agenda in 1865. So when we try to understand Flying Dutchman, we cannot do so. At least we can understand a lot about Wagner and what he's trying to say about what he had done when he wrote Flying Dutchman. But that's Wagner 30 years later. And Wagner needed later in life to say that the big instigation to write operas is Carl Maria von Weber, because Weber is German and a figure highly caught up in German nationalism. Even more to the point, he's a German who did not wasn't a turncoat and went and wrote operas in French in Paris, as did Meyerbeer and Halevi, two composers that Wagner, of course, becomes very much against. Nor, for instance, like Haydn, earlier composers who wrote for the Italian world. I think that the opera composers that Wagner really knew better, much more, and had much more effect on him than Weber, are not Bellini, whom I think Wagner probably knew somewhat because he did do one performance of, he put on a performance of Tirata in Würzburg and also in Magdeburg. But rather of composers of a completely different sort, which would have had much more interest to him as a burgeoning composer of German music. And these are Spohr, who was a German composer who wrote mostly in Italian medium, and then Aubert And then Spontini, Aubert and Spontini. Aubert, in spite of his name, I think is a German. Is a French name, but I think he's German. I don't know very much about Aubert, so somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. He's probably written one of those books there. Aubert wrote an opera of incredible importance called La Muette dei Portici, which is means the mute woman of the Portici, which is in Portici are the galleries in Palermo. And it's really the dawn of grand opera. It's sort of proto-grand opera, which he wrote for Paris. And is followed very shortly by the composer Spontini. Spontini is an Italian composer who went and composed in France. They both have a predecessor, a very important composer, actually more than one predecessor, of composers who went and worked in France in Napoleonic France. And I think to understand the background of Wagner's early years, we need to spend just a minute talking about the music of Napoleonic France, the role of music in Napoleonic France. The great composer of Napoleonic France was Cherubini, an Italian who went and spent most of his life in France, Luigi Cherubini. His most famous opera, I guess, is Médée in French, but he also wrote many other operas, L'Odalisque, a great popular, respected figure in his time. Beethoven respected him a great deal, and a composer that Muti conducts a lot, is very, very fond of. Actually, he likes all of these guys. Salieri, he likes all of these. Along with a French composer named Mayeux, who was active also in the Napoleonic era, Cherubini established sort of a foundation upon which Aubert and Spontini, and then later Meyerbeer, Halevi, and to some extent Wagner grew, although quite different. And they actually are much more fertile ground for Wagner than Meyerbeer would prove to be. The role of opera in 17th and 18th century Europe, the traditional role of opera. Opera started in Florence with Jacopo Peri and Monteverdi, and then Baroque opera in general, was about the voice, spectacular voices, spectacular scenery, ostentation of wealth and power, the glorification of the nobility of the time, very much suiting the taste of the nobility, the tremendous amount of pomp and circumstance, the very term Baroque, first used music talking about opera, with lots and lots of ballet. And then of course there's the big revolution that occurs with a German composer working in France, Gluck, pretty much a contemporary of Mozart, who tries to sort of simplify opera, go back to a much more simple version, but still opera very much based on mythological stories. An aspect of opera, by the way, which I don't know how aware you are of, is that not only do they use mythological stories, they use the same librettos. There was a famous librettist named Metastasio in the middle of the 18th century who wrote 56 librettos, out of which 2,500 plus operas were written. Some of his librettos were used 300 or 400 times by the composers. The idea, I mean, it was, because this was, the story itself was absolutely just a structure. You did a mythological story because this gave you a convenient framework to have the pomp and circumstance, or to utilize the singers that you had in your stable, etc. And if your king liked ballet, lots of ballet scenes. If your king liked chorus, lots of choral music, or whatever. And Gluck stripped away all the pomp and circumstance, but didn't really strip away the idea of still using mythological subjects. And when the French Revolution came, one of the great characteristics of art in the French Revolution, think about, actually this is a perfect example, I wish I had the paintings here to show, is great French painter under Louis XVI, Wagner. These very sensual, bubbly, lots of flesh and pink and light and all this. And then 5 years later, Jean-Louis David, the arrangement, mythological subjects, very straight lines, very, very formal. And it has called universally neoclassic. Neoclassic in painting terms, because it harkens back to the Renaissance. It's trying to go back to this, very much into symmetry, very much into the play of lines and objects, very serious, very moralistic. And this took over all the arts in Napoleonic France. Yes, there was a certain element of pomp and circumstance too. I just look at the portraits of Napoleon that he had made for himself. They get more and more over the top. But the music that Napoleon liked and the opera that was in Napoleon's was like Cherubini. Cherubini adapted himself to his taste. And one of the great ironies in classical music, I just did a series in Italy talking about classicism in music. And one of the great ironies in music is that we have, our classical period has nothing to do with anybody else's because it has nothing to do with ancient Greece or Rome. We don't know anything about ancient Greek and Roman music. Our classical period is Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, basically. Vienna, 1770, 1825, let's say. But it's one of the true ironies of music history, that at the exact same time as we have the greatest master of classicism, which would be Beethoven, we have one of the most famous masters universally considered to be neoclassic, Cherubini. So you have neoclassic and classic at the same time, which is very confusing, but actually a little less confusing if you realize that they refer to two completely different ideas of classicism. Beethoven is classic, Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart are classic, because they defined the ideals of classicism in musical terms for the first time. And they become central to musical thought in the same kind of way that the Renaissance and even more ancient Greece and Rome became to the other arts. Whereas neoclassic in the sense of Cherubini or Meilland or Sfor or Spontini to some extent, Spontini, Holberg to some extent, is because of the very self-conscious desire on their part to refer themselves to the archaic, the classical world of Greek and Rome, but the values of very clear-cut moral theater, moral, symmetrical, with all these sort of rationalistic, rationalistic is a poor word, logical, all makes sense. You avoid situations where there's a triumph of the supernatural or triumph of emotion. Emotion excessive emotion is punished. Like in traditional Greek, pre-Euripides Greek theater, let's say. It's very, for instance, in Medea, the most successful of these operas. Now Medea, of course, goes mad and kills her children because she's jilted. But Medea we have sympathy for Medea, but I don't think the Cherubini did. And in a way the music doesn't, in a sense. It's sort of judging this world. But even more to the point, the desire to write in these sort of mythological frameworks and have very formalistic, I don't know if you've seen Medea or Meilland's operas. Meilland, for instance, wrote an opera on essentially the same text that Beethoven used for Fidelio. And they really, Fidelio was a triumph, of course, it's a very popular genre, what do they call it, the liberation. Prisoner is free. There's an actual technical term for that. It's your world, what do they call that kind of drama when there's a prisoner who's free? It's very popular in the 1820s.
Rescue drama.
Excuse me?
Rescue drama.
Yes, thank you.
Rescue drama.
Rescue drama.
Rescue drama.
Rescue drama. Rescue drama grows perfectly out in the case of Beethoven's. The whole Napoleonic operatic world, because it's the triumph of good over evil. The evil tyrant fits into French Revolutionary world perfectly. The evil tyrant who has the prisoner, unjustly chained, and then he's liberated by his noble life, and then the good guy comes and blesses the union and all this. It's incredibly noble and valiant and very chaste also at the same time. And it's a very chaste kind of music. A very passion is not an important element. Very four-square, very symmetrical. But this, nevertheless, is the only game in town, operatically, outside of Italy. In Italy, we have Rossini. What happens is, as far as the history of music, and then we'll try to get Wagner into this, that Italian opera continues winning its merry way. Paris becomes this extremely magnetic capital because of money, really. And people flock to Paris. All these foreign composers flock to Paris. And create a style which grows out of this neoclassic style, which we call grand opera. And the main characteristics of grand opera are that it retains usually a very clear moralistic, and in some cases, a very clear political framework. It's much more political opera Even some, well, Roberto Di Alva's not, but many of them are. Much more clearly, like me, one that Wagner very much admired, Persecution of the Jews. I mean, it's kind of interesting that he admired that opera, but he did. But very clear moral agenda, very clear, and that political to that extent. And yet what happens is that it becomes more and more international. Well, this is very much an outgrowth of the French Revolution. French revolutionary art is very much about international. It downplays its French character, and indeed, its most important composer is Italian. And the most important composers of grand opera is the following. It's in French, but there's Alevi and Meyerbeer, who are German Jews. There's Spontini, there's Abol, who's actually from the Pyrenees. There's Spontini, who's Italian. There's all sorts of people who are writing French opera in French language for a very international flair. Now, we know this about Wagner from the very start. Wagner was very much called the nationalism. So grand opera, just by its very international sense, has a repugnant aspect to Wagner. But there are aspects of grand opera which were very attractive to Wagner. One is its continuity from its source, that it still has this use of mythological subjects, or at least subjects that have the sort of importance, volume, if not actual myth, at least important stories. For instance, the story of Fidelia. If we go back to that story, it's not myth, of course, but it's such a clear, the lessons in the story, the morals of the story, the evil tyrant, the unjustly imprisoned hero who's liberated by his valiant heroic wife. I mean, it's a story that's got very clear cut. It's not like the story of Trovatore, for instance. I mean, that has evil tyrants too, but it's got lots of other agendas, or even Traviata for that matter, or Flying Dutchman for that matter, either different kind of story. But Wagner actually never wrote a story in any way which is like a true mythological grand opera story. Closest. Close to the romantic opera story, perhaps. But no, he never really does, because he has his own agenda. Because don't forget that Wagner's first interest, first love was a myth, but drama. He wanted to be a dramatist himself. And all these things I'm talking about happening in opera are not necessarily at all following what's happening in theater. Theater, we have the beginning of dramatic theater, we have the beginning of opera. We have, he's not writing theater, some theater. Oh yes, sure. We have an entirely different thing happening. This is, by the way, a very important aspect, and one of the reasons why I think Wagner in his early period is sort of disconnected, because music is disconnected from theater. Wagner comes onto the scene at a point when music and theater are very disconnected. Well, just from what I said at the beginning, that in 1820, 1830, universally the great composer was considered to be Beethoven. And yet Beethoven's music had no place whatsoever in the opera of the time. None of these composers had any use for Beethoven. I think Wagner was attracted to the seriousness and sort of moral correctness of the French Napoleonic opera, which becomes grand opera. Grand opera is basically French Napoleonic opera, onto which an enormous amount of theatrical artifice has been involved. Grand opera is much closer in many respects to certain kinds of modern popular theater than it is to opera. Music becomes less and less important. The biggest single success, this is probably in the context of what we're talking about, worth mentioning, the biggest success in the history of opera, unquestionably, this is one of my favorite things, the biggest success. This came about, I had a teacher once who pointed out that the biggest success in the history of literature was Goethe's the sufferings of young Werther, because probably 50% of the literate world had read it 10 years after its publication, which is fairly astonishing. Probably true. But the most successful opera in history is, anybody want to hazard a guess? I don't even think there's a close, from a success at a time of composition.
Magic Flute. Magic Flute?
Which one?
Magic Flute.
Magic Flute? No, Magic Flute was popular, but nothing like this. Meyerbeer. Which one? Which one?
You can answer.
Yeah, Le Huguenot, which Le Huguenot is not the right one, but Le Huguenot, of course, is much closer, has a lot more in common with the Napoleonic opera. Meyerbeer is going back to that a little bit. In his later operas, he does. La Fliegende, more serious. Sure, it still has all the pomp and circumstance and the vocal shenanigans and things, huge ballet scenes and huge crowd scenes, huge coup de théâtre. But Robert le Diable, which has practically no, it's only cheapo value. The single most popular scene in the history of opera, not only the most Robert le Diable, Robert le Diable was put on for one performance and played 365 nights in a row, I think. Liszt made a transcription of 2 scenes from Robert le Diable, and they had like 800 editions in like 6 months. I mean, nobody could play them, they're much too hard, but everybody wanted them because it was Robert le Diable. Robert le Diable has a scene that was truly the quintessential, really the beginning of the worst elements of grand opera. The scene of the skating dead nuns. Yes. Well, see, no, the main, we really should, instead of showing this Wagner stuff, we should show it and have fun. The main character is a necromancer who raises from the dead sinful nuns who do a naughty ballet on skates. Oh yes. And this was a total sensation. It remained building. I mean, it was successful for 75 years. And so was Rienzi. Much of the popularity of Rienzi is because it had elements that I think people, all the crowd scenes, all things we dislike the most about Rienzi today, were many of the reasons why it was so popular at the time. So anyway, this is sort of this background. I think that Wagner himself has misled us a little bit when we look at the sources of his operas. Wagner had this plan that he was going to learn to write opera. He was a self-taught guy, and he was going to learn to write opera by writing one German, one Italian, and one international style, Paris style. The fact is that they're not so easily divided in that category as Wagner himself would lead us to believe. There are certain aspects of Liebesverbot, when we get to it, I'll talk about that, which are more Italian sounding. There certainly are aspects of Die Fee that are more, sound more like Weber. And the idea that his family wanted him to write an opera like Weber, and he thought it would be a good thing to write an opera like Weber, is probably true. Of course, Die Fee was never played at all, Liebesverbot was practically never played at all. That's another thing. We put these 3 operas together. Two of them were total fiascos. I mean, one never got played, and the other was played hundreds and hundreds of times. Only Lohengrin, by the way. At the end of the 19th century, somebody actually added up the number of performances of all of Wagner's operas. And the only Wagner opera that has many performances is Rienzi was Lohengrin. Meistersinger not, surprisingly enough.
Didn't have the time, really.
Yeah, didn't have the Meistersinger was that's absolutely true. 1868, Rienzi has since 1842 to get this site, but it was always an enormous success. Also, there's another difference too, which is Rienzi's 5.5 hours. Rienzi is as long as any opera Wagner. I think that a complete Rienzi would be at least as long as a complete Parsifal. Yeah, 6 hours, they said, with intermissions, yeah, at least as long. But Rienzi, for instance, the most famous recording of Rienzi musically is that Joseph Kripp's recording of Tristan Ludwig, which is the one I have, which he's cut 80% of the music. 80% of the music. You know, and there are people who say, it's better for it. And that was, of course, in the 19th century they did too. So you people have tried, but you can't cut Meistersinger like that. Not to that extent. There's too much stuff in it. Whereas Rienzi, you can really cut a lot. It doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. I mean, you lose some of the pomp and circumstance, probably. Anyway, so the situation with the 3 operas is, I think, a little different than Wagner painted it. In my opinion, all 3 of them have, more especially Liebesverbot and Rienzi, have a stronger French sound. Not so much French as French music, but French as music that people were writing in France at the time. Die Fee less. I'll show in a second. For instance, I think that the Liebesverbot passage that is traditionally supposed to sound like Bellini actually sounds almost identical to an opera that Wagner conducted in life as a young man by this composer, Ehold, who I think that's a changed name, and I think he was German. But Ehold is there's all sorts of mysteries about Ehold. But he wrote many very popular operas for Paris, and the most popular of which is this enormous 5-act opera called Zombie. When I was a kid, they used to still play Zampa Overture. And if you guys ever goes, remember that? It's very popular in comic, for comics, I think. Cartoons. Actually, that sounds more like Leaves for Both than anything else. Melanie thinks that Gilbert and Sullivan sounds more like Leaves. She has a point, but I think Gilbert and Sullivan sounds a lot like something. So, anyway, and Zampa, that's not that hasn't probably been formed in many, many years. Yeah. Have you ever?
I think we've done it in Paris.
Are you saying Zamba?
Z-A-M-P-A. And the composer's name is Ehol, H-E with an accent, R-O-L-D. And it was 1828 in Paris. The operas that Wagner most was influenced by are La Nuit des Portici of Aubert and several operas of Spontini. I think that the idea of putting it in Sicily was very much La Nuit des Portici. Sicily was sort of in vogue in its way, so taking Shakespeare's play and setting it in Sicily, I think, kind of helped that whole image. I do think that probably he thought that Italy was the land of sensuality, and he has that quote in the novel and stuff about they're going to go and get their blood hot and things, but get all tan and stuff. It's a very strange image. But I think that actually the model was probably more French than Italian. Wagner didn't know and admire Bellini. Bellini's a very difficult composer to copy. Actually, nobody really did. And Bellini's operas that Wagner liked the most, he didn't know yet. They were out this early. Wagner got to know Puritani and Norma only when he was in Paris. The same is true, by the way, of Meyerbeer. There's a whole lot of talk about that Meyerbeer's influence on Rienzi, and that Rienzi was Wagner's desire to emulate Meyerbeer. But actually, Wagner had written the first 3 acts of Rienzi before he'd heard anything at all of Meyerbeer's other than Roberto Diablo, which he never liked very much. I mean, he did like Lady Little very much at one time in his life, and wrote very thrilling and moving things about it, which it doesn't deserve. And some other Meyerbeer he actually liked, but those are pieces he got to know after he was in Paris. And Wagner had already written most of Rienzi when he arrived in Paris. The model for Rienzi is mostly Spontini, and this more formal kind of grand opera. Believe it or not, Rienzi does not have enough spectacular pomp and circumstance. Well, he gets to the end with sort of the big conflagration. That's probably perhaps a little bit more the influence of Meyerbeer. Also, I think there's another very simple point that Wagner was admiring at that age of someone like Meyerbeer, and also of Spontini. Here are foreigners who went to Paris and became famous. I think, he was a foreigner and wanted to be famous, so there's enough of that. But this was another example, I think, of why this early Wagner is so problematic for himself. He's cut himself off from the music that he knows is the best, because there is no operatic tradition of Beethoven. Therefore, he's cut himself off from Beethoven. He's cut himself off from something which he believes very deeply, which is nationalism. Because other than Weber, I'm going to return to Weber now, and I'm going to start with the thing. Other than Weber, there is no German national opera. I mean, the opera in Germany is leaving Germany. It is going in other directions. And so there's no tradition for him to hold on to. So he's sort of cutting himself off from himself. So it's an apprenticeship in a way, and he's picking up what other people are doing, but he's doing so already in a light that is in odds with himself, which I think does describe the curious quality of these early works. And that's something that now we're actually going to listen to quite a bit. There is another very big difference, and this is something that Mr. Sessions talked quite a lot about, between listening to Befang or to Rienzi or to Liebesverboten and listening, let's say, to the early works of Verdi, or for that matter, to the earliest works of Beethoven, the WOO works he wrote in Bonn, or other very early works of composers that were later discarded and never heard again. The early operas of Verdi are certainly as bad, in my opinion, as the early operas of Wagner. But they sound like early bad operas of Verdi. They sound like Verdi trying to find his way. Verdi, who's not very expert yet, who hasn't figured out how to write for orchestra very well yet, who is still very clumsy with certain of the conventions. He's just kind of, but who is very recognizably in his world. There is no opera of Verdi's that doesn't sound like Verdi. There is no early work of Beethoven's that doesn't sound like Beethoven. It sounds like bad early Beethoven. It sounds like bad early Verdi. Wagner's first three works, most of the time, don't sound like Wagner. They just don't sound like Wagner. Even the good things don't sound like Wagner. And as I'm going to show tonight a little bit now, the thing that is absolutely the most Wagnerian in the early works is the Liebesvermögen, arguably the weakest of the three, which definitely does have some Wagnerian things in it. But it has nothing to do with the quality. It has to do simply with there are certain things there that Wagner does pick up on later on. So now I'd like to indulge us for a second, and we're going to listen to the complete overture of Die Fee. And then I'll talk about it. Now, I think that it's worthwhile listening to these overtures, since none of us, I mean, we don't hear these pieces all the time. To hear the whole overture, I think it's better for us to get an idea of what we're talking about. Then we're going to hear the overtures of all three of the operas now tonight, the three of the operas. What can we say about this overture? What is Wagner trying to do with it, and what is and what isn't it? I think we'd all agree that it has some nice things in it. We'd also all agree that it goes on much too long. I think, in my personal opinion, the number one thing that it lacks is a convincing sense of continuity. You feel almost continuously that Wagner is not sure what to do next. And sometimes there's just these kind of funny holes, these kind of funny, awkward sort of changes, or if he doesn't know, repeat it again, as he does there at the end. But there's no particular reason for us to hear this in the which he uses again, which sort of typifies a lot of the things that's wrong with early Wagner, in my opinion. But the biggest problem, even if one likes that material, is, I think, a very poor sense of continuity, a very poor sense of form. It's formally a very bad piece. It falls apart. What kind of overture is this? There are lots of different kinds of overtures. Wagner himself writes lots of different kinds of overtures. There are a lot of different kinds of overture stoppers. What kind of overture is this? Anybody have an idea? I think this is one of these overtures where the composer basically tells the story of the entire opera in the overture. The overture, for instance, is full of material that we'll hear later in the opera. There's like at least 6 themes that come later in the opera. By the way, let's be very clear, that has nothing whatsoever to do with leitmotifs. Nothing. I mean, using material from the overture and the opera is something which has been going on since the 17th century to some extent. And it's just a way of sort of preparing people to hear their favorite tunes. It has one thing to do with leitmotifs, but not with leitmotifs per se, which is that it does have the value that when a theme comes back that we've already heard, it has a certain resonance, it has a certain importance to us because we've already heard it. Immaterial of in what context or what way, it's just familiar to us. So it adds a certain kind of importance to us, a certain resonance that it has. And that it does do. And pretty much all the material in this overture comes later in the opera. And it comes later in the opera in ways which will tell the story of the conflict of the two worlds, the mortal world and the fairy world, the immortal world, and the conflict of both the fairy queen and her love for the mortal and her desire not to lose him, and her decision to give up her immortality, which ultimately she doesn't have to do, and all the big struggle of Arundel, the mortal king, and his desire for his love and the impossibility of passing the test that he's been given, etc. So it's full of all the conflict. There is parts of the music, and certainly in the scenario, that remind me of Weber. Not, however, of the Weber of Freischütz, but of a rather different Weber, the Weber of Oberon, sort of a kind of Shakespearean opera that Weber wrote for London, and where he died, and which was actually written in English. The original libretto of Oberon is in English. Have you ever heard it in English? I never have.
No, you can heard it in German.
I heard it in German too once. Only one beautiful piece, actually. Doesn't work in the theater, of course, but the only one of his operas. He only really wrote 3 operas that had lasted. Euryanthe is the second, Freischütz, Euryanthe, and Oberon. And really only Freischütz works very well as a theatrical piece. Also because he too was wrestling with this what can you do with Beethoven's music in the theater. One of the reasons, by the way, which hasn't been brought up yet, as to why Weber is not a more important influence on Wagner, other than sort of symbolically because of being German and taking it seriously, is that he died so young. I mean, he died at 40. And a very interesting little side bit about Weber is that Weber started out life, like many great composers, as a critic. Robert Schumann did as well. But whereas Robert Schumann started out life as a very revolutionary critic, applauding all the revolutionary movements in music, and became increasingly conservative as he got older and more under the influence of his father-in-law. Weber started out like this super reactionary critic, and Weber wrote some of the most absolutely devastatingly bad reviews for Beethoven's symphonies. I'm sure that Weber spent the rest of his life ruining the things he said about the Eroica, the Fourth Symphony, the Fourth Piano Concerto, and their world premieres. He was writing for a musical newspaper in Vienna as a 19 and 20-year-old. The dates, by the way, for your Weber were incorrect, if I made some bold with it. Right? He was born in 1786, not in 1789. So. He was only 18 when they did the Eroica and he wrote the review, but he would have been 15 then, which would have been really young. But anyway, nevertheless, he died too young. He's not a composer who found his voice early. I mean, he wrote everything between the age of 30 and 40 when he died. So it's a very concentrated period. Does anybody remember a letter that Wagner wrote to? Well, he actually wrote it twice, basically. To Matilda von Besenonk is the most famous one, but he wrote more or less the same thing in a letter about a week later to Liszt from Venice in the winter of 1858, when he's writing, he's finishing the love duet, the second act of Tristan, and starting to sketch the third act of Tristan. There's a very famous letter that Wagner writes in the letter that what he considers to be his greatest genius, his greatest ability. Anybody remember what it is? Transition. Transition. Everybody in the room knows that. What is the greatest thing missing in this overture to be thanked? Transition. Transition. The thing that Wagner has not figured out is exactly what he is the most proud of, is his ability to make continuity. What is the big problem? Now, we were going back to what kind of overture this is. Okay, this is an overture that tells the story of the opera. Could anybody name me another overture that tells the story of an opera? By Wagner or by anybody else? I can think of one by Wagner that very much does. Most of his don't, but one that very much does. And I can think of
Fliegende
what?
Holländer?
Yeah, to a point. That was the one I was thinking about. It does somewhat in the way this one does. Meistersinger does, but I think really very pictorially, so does Tannhäuser. If you do the Dresden original overture, it really kind of does too. I mean, the chorus, the Pilgrim's chorus. But anyway, they all do. But every one of these examples, however, and what about Leonard No. 3 of Beethoven? That's a famous one, where Beethoven ends up changing it because he was convinced, and rightfully so, that it so strongly tells the story of the opera that it makes the opera superfluous. The convention, does anyone know who was the first to have the convention of adding Leonard No. 3? Because it was no longer ever done as the overture. And it hasn't been done as the overture of Fidelio's since Beethoven's lifetime. But it's such a great piece that they didn't want not to do it. So they started doing it between the first and second scenes of Act 2. Anyone know who the first to do that was? Wagner. Yes, that's right. Wagner. We don't know for sure that he did it. He said to do it. The first person we know that did it is Mahler. But I imagine that Wagner did it. Wagner conducted it plenty of times. Anyway, interesting idea. Okay, so those are all Tannhäuser, Flying Dutchman. But there's operas about no Verdi opera does that. No Verdi opera tells the story of the opera. Yeah, Forza Ostino would be the closest. Forza Ostino was the longest, and it doesn't tell the whole story, but it does give a capsule. But Forza Ostino is yet another example. What do all of those overtures have? This one doesn't. All of them. Certainly Flying Dutchman and Tannhäuser, and even Meistersinger. Meistersinger less. Let's eliminate Meistersinger for a second. Meistersinger does not work for my pieces here. certainly Forza Ostino does. Or if you wanted to say that Parsifal tells the story, even Parsifal would to some extent. They all are written within schematic formal designs. They have forms that you can define in some kind of a formal way. You can say like A, B, A, or A, B, A, C, A, B, A, with each letter representing a block of music. You know, the Tannhäuser overture is A, B, development A, for instance, basically, right? With the return of the A being much shorter, which is a common technique. Leonard No. 3, Beethoven, which is the model for all of these kind of overtures, is the most successful, isn't sonata form. It's like a symphonic piece. It could almost exist, if you eliminated the reference of the trumpet, in a way it could exist beautifully as a great symphonic work, which is how we hear it, after all. It has a symphonic form. So here, I think that the big problem in this overture, besides the musical problem, which I'd like to talk about sort of globally when we get to Rienzi, is that Wagner is not able, he does not want to write in a traditional schematic form. And either he doesn't want to, or doesn't know how to, or doesn't feel comfortable. Many composers, by the way, most composers, by the way, in 1830, did not feel comfortable writing in schematic forms. Schumann, Chopin, Liszt, all felt very uncomfortable. The only composer active in 1830, important composer, who was comfortable in those forms, was Mendelssohn, who has a very strong classical background, very strong ties to Mozart, especially, not really so much Beethoven, although Beethoven was his great love. All of them love Beethoven, except for Chopin. Anyway, that's just a period of, I think they felt uncomfortable with the classical organized forms because Beethoven and Haydn and Mozart had ultimately done them so well that it was just kind of overwhelming example. So they were getting away from it, they were finding new ways to organize music. Brahms is later. We forget Brahms could have been Wagner's son. For instance, the earliest Brahms pieces, like the three piano sonatas, were written at the same time as Tristan. And Brahms' first symphony is written the same year as Parsifal, the first symphony. So Brahms feels plenty comfortable in traditionals, and he's kind of redone his own way. But that's a long time later. That's I'm talking about when Brahms is not even born yet. 1830, 1835. Brahms was born in 1833. So this is, but it's a logical question. I think it became easier again to write in the traditional classical forms, sort of in a new way, skipping a generation. I think that happens in the arts, not bad in truth. When something has been tremendously successful, it comes to a certain point beyond which people can't go for a while. But Wagner nevertheless wants, there is a solution. The solution of all of Verdi's early operas, and Donizetti's operas, and Bellini's operas, and Meyerbeer's operas, and Spontini's operas, and Cherubini's operas, they have another solution. They don't write this kind of overture. They write a short overture, which is a prelude to the scene that follows. It's a setup overture. That's mostly what Wagner wrote afterwards, in The Ring, for instance. All the overtures. Tristan is kind of a special case. But generally speaking, there are other ways. No, but Wagner wanted, because Wagner's favorite composer is still Beethoven. It's the composer that he thinks is writing important music. He wanted to write a big blockbuster overture that's 11 minutes long that tells the whole story of the opera. It's a great symphonic piece, a big symphonic overture, like, in this case, the files are the Weber overtures. All the Weber operas, all three of the overtures, do tell the story, or all three do are big, full-scale orchestral pieces that pretty much, Freiser's story, certainly, that's the whole story, but it gives a picture of the story with the full-scale music and the conflict and then Agatha's Binaria and stuff. But all three of them are in sonata form. They're all three in sonata form. All of his overtures are. They have clear-cut schematic forms. I don't want to get into what sonata form is or isn't right now, but there's clear-cut schematic forms. They have a form that you can define from outside the music, which of course is enormously helpful. It doesn't solve the problems of transitions, by the way. It doesn't solve the problems of continuity, but it certainly changes and conditions them. If you know that the next thing in the piece is something, has to be something, and you have to get from there to there, at least you have a roadmap. You may not be good at getting from there to there, and Wagner probably wouldn't be good at that at this point either, really. But nevertheless, at least you have the roadmap. Whereas Wagner, in his first overture, is charting off on, setting out in uncharted waters. I have no idea what the formal structure of the Fey overture is. I mean, I'm a professional musician. This is what I do, and I can usually figure out the structure of just about anything. But this is, it seems, yes, I mean, kind of. It's alternating between the three basic worlds: the pure fairy world at the beginning, then the more human world, which is almost a direct quote, by the way, from Oberon. And then that triumphant march thing, which I guess probably symbolizes the resolution of the problem. But the way it's organized is so full of holes, so full of insecurities, and so full of stops and starts. that he has not yet figured out how to do this. Okay, I'd like to play one or two other passages from the Fame before Bill listen to track 4 of scene. This is Arindel, the male character, who is in despair. He's just asked the forbidden question and she's disappeared. He's not supposed to ask certain questions. And like you know, where she comes from and things like that. Which should ring a bell. That's for Sunday. And when he does ask the question, she disappears. And so he's now in despair because he was unable not to ask the question. Musically quite successful. And it exploits the aspects of the overture, which I think is the most successful. What's this lacking so far is a regular melody. There's no clear-cut melody in this music. So it's something very important is not here. It has this fragment, this basic fragment. Which is the minor because he's in despair, which is sort of one of the three big themes of the overture that's come back here. Not as a light note, this is just echoing the overture. But I think one of the things that makes it effective and good, Wagner already is good at it, is creating this sense of emotional tension outside the framework of a regular punctuated melody. Outside what we would call a periodic melody. Periodic melody is one which is like Mary Had a Little Lamb, which it has a clear-cut, like regular rhythm, like a poem that scans regularly. Wagner still is primarily writing music in this way. As we know, Wagner will get away from writing music like this. And by the time we get to the Ring, those parts of the Ring that are periodic, like Winterstürme, which is one, are they really stick out. They sound very different from the rest, because, or the forging song parts of it, because they purposely sound different. They're purposely harking back to a different kind of music. Wagner is perhaps here recognizing, or just by accident perhaps, recognizing something which he is innately very, very good at. Is this ability to use music to create a constant flow of emotion. Something which is perhaps not well expressed in regular periodic melody. What makes regular periodic melody regular? I think I'd rather wait when we do Rienzi, talk about it all at once. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. Bells, now could you go to track 9? This is the intro, and I'll stop when we start, to one of the two really big Shanas. Ada has this huge Shana. big shame. The introduction, it's almost the end of the introduction. Now, this is another example, I think. First thing, the continuity again is very poor. It's very difficult to follow a sequence of ideas. But here, I think even more clearly than in the overture, the individual ideas are really quite beautiful and quite expressive of different states. I mean, the point is she's very conflicted. He's trying to show all of her various states of mind. And so what he doesn't seem to have yet is the ability to go. Using his instruments to create a shifting emotional state is a very important element of Wagner's success later on. He already has some elements of this in the music. I can't think of any other composer who would write such an involved instrumental introduction to a shame before. What? But not before. Not before. Benvenuto Cellini is about the same time. But Cellini's more classical. Certainly he has big introductions. But maybe, yeah, it's such a different tradition. And Benvenuto Cellini goes using very strict formal things. It doesn't have this sort of free, this again is very free form. So I really think that a big problem is still, to me even more clearly, the problem with the introduction and also the overture is a lot of the music is weak. I don't think any of the music is weak here, but it just doesn't, the sequence of the music isn't really good. Okay, let's go now, Bells, to Leave Us for a Moment and listen to track 1, which is the overture. You can hear the whole thing. Oh no. My sentiments exactly. But I think it's only fair. If we're going to be here to discuss it, we should hear some of it.
When you were saying it's so musically pretty, I just found it incredibly repetitious. I mean, it just kept playing in the same way in the introduction. The same 3 or 4 notes, whatever it is, by different instruments. But it was just like the same thing.
I don't think so. I mean, you could say that's.
It wasn't like boring.
Certainly, I would agree that the overall effect is certainly boring. I don't find, actually, none of the music we've listened to yet strikes me so much boring as an end. The boring ends are very different. Actually, I personally find the material, in this case, not it's repetitious in that he's using the same little bits of fragments and so does Beethoven, so does Wagner, all of his later works. I mean, the amount of fragments are very small.
Yeah, but here it doesn't seem to be developed.
But it doesn't seem to go anywhere.
Just repeated it.
Well, not exactly, but it doesn't seem to go anywhere. And there, I think that's the whole point of what I was listening to the episode for. Is I think the material is okay, but I don't think that he yet knows how to make it go anywhere. And the reason for that is sort of the whole point of my talk. So, and will not become clear until tomorrow. This is all forced by the way. Okay. If we can't stand it, we can turn it off. But we really should listen to the whole thing. feel-goodish kind of stuff. It's really quite delightful in some way. And we all smile and laugh and wink because it sounds so inappropriate. It sounds inappropriate because it doesn't sound like Wagner in the slightest. It sounds sort of like samba. It sounds like a lot of light, slight comic opera. But I think it's perfectly pleasant. The problem is that it's juxtaposed with this very self-importantly motive, which he even actually develops, something which he has not done in fact. This one actually does, and will. I need to get far. He actually will I can see that too. He'll do things with the thing. Now, it strikes me that there's exactly one spot, which we're going to hear again now. Bells move to track 14, please. This is a big confrontation scene between Friedrich and Isabella. The guy who's forbidden love, who's in love with her, and she's come to beg for her brother, who's going to be put to death because he's had sex. And he finds that he's falling in love with her. And he has this place where he says, "My God, am I a man? And what's going on in me?" And he's full of conflict. Okay, let's just play for 14 times. It's not that long a track. So she's come in and he's saying, "So tell me what's the problem." He's feeling very self-satisfied and confident. What she just said, I don't have the music, so I'm doing it with my ear now. She said, that's a variation of the big forbidden love. It's a development it's a transformation of the thing. As far as I know, the first time Wagner does something like that. That's the kind of thing he does in the ring. He's taken the forbidden love and turns it into quite a different melody. Based on that forbidden love thing. introducted, that's the lead. This is to Mark. I want to get what he starts to sing. This last phrase, by the way, which I actually have. Which is based sort of on a big long extension of that forbidding love poem. It doesn't sound so bad, actually. And it has something else very typical of later Wagner, which is that it has that one bass thing. The bottom note doesn't change. It stays this note. It builds up a big crescendo using that. In other words, it's not periodic. Yes, it has little phrases that repeat themselves, but it's creating a big long line by using what we call a harmonic pedal. The harmony stays the same. The bottom of the harmony stays the same. Harmonies change over it. And so what that does is it creates a kind of a long line. Wagner becomes the absolute master of this. Enormous quantities of Wagner's greatest music, especially Tristan, is based on exactly this thing. Okay, let's move to Rienzi now. And let's listen to the prelude to Rienzi. So that's the overture to Rienzi. Now, I'm going to get some feedback from you in a second. Just one thing, one advantage that Rienzi clearly has, the overture at least, over the other, over Die Fang and Liebesverwaltung. And to what extent it's better or not, I think in some ways it's clearly better. Is that it was written after the opera was completed. And so when you're going to write an overture which is going to be a summation of the work as a whole, the fact that you've already written the work as a whole and can select the best bits is clearly an advantage, which is clearly what he's done. He has selected the best bits. So that part is, and also this is slightly closer to a standard form than the overtures of, this is much less radical formally than the overtures of either Die Fang or Liebesverwaltung, which are much more sort of free form. This one has more sort of the rudiments of a normal overture form, sort of on a very large scale, of course, but still. Anybody, yes?
When you played the first overture, what stood out to me was the high drama in it. I thought, my God, there was this little story that Simon told us about this opera, and here's all this drama, it sounded like damnation. And I thought, this is a man whose sense of drama is much larger than his libretto. And the same, to a lesser extent, the second overture had that same thing. It's not a big dramatic story. I mean, there's no war, there's no massacre, there's nothing awful happening, and yet there's something awful happening in the music. Now, I don't know the story of Rienzi, and he didn't tell us the story.
Oh, the story of Rienzi has lots of really big-time fighting and massacres and a huge public conflagration.
This might fit the topic better.
Yeah.
This might fit the topic
All right,
better.
that's a good point. It fits the topic better. I would agree with that, actually. Yes.
It seems to me that in the first of the overtures we heard, he had a palette of musical bits, techniques, and the like, and he was just sort of picking those one at a time, never mixing them, and there was, rather than continuity, I think there was no progression. And in the third we saw there was I thought, a progression. He had an idea, he played it out, and he knew what to do next. And then, you come back around and hear it.
Sure, it feels, now I don't always get that feeling. There are places in this overture where I really say, I feel Wagner is very much at sea and doesn't know what to do next. But that's more on local points. I can stop the music and say, here I don't think he knows what to do, and here I don't think he knows what to do. But overall, he definitely has a plan. It's much more conventional, but it's much more successful as an overall plan. I think I would definitely agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it falls into that definition you made earlier of more schematic.
Yes.
And it sounds sometimes as if he doesn't know where he's going because there's so much repetition and throwing things back in and the kitchen soup that it just plays a bit, and that sometimes gives it a sense.
I would agree with that too.
There is a little bit more of the Wagner no best. Not much, but...
No. And I'm going to get into that. Did you hear what he said? It sounds more like Wagner, yes.
Yes, I think he used some more sophisticated techniques, particularly in the beginning part. I heard some transitions, I heard some leading into a more dramatic part.
Once he did, there's one place in the overture of Rienzi which I think Wagner really does his first good transition, and that's getting into the big tune. Actually, getting into the big tune is the first place perhaps the only place in 6 hours of Rienzi that I think that Wagner really does get something. That absolutely.
He also used some dissonance to get some tension built up.
Right. Yes, he does. He does so in that sort of phrase that I guess is counteract that bum, that was quite diminished seventh chords. It is dissonant. It's also very conventional. That's one aspect of this overture. That this overture is more successful than the first two. It's also much more conventional than the first two. By conventional, I mean he uses the stock and trade of theater. Whether he knows it better by now, or whether it's just that he because he's writing the grand opera or whatever, it's certainly more conventional.
The fact that it has a big tune.
Now that's, of course, a good point.
Yeah.
There is Wagner has, that's true. Wagner's first famous tune is that's actually from Rienzi's prayer. Sounds much better. I always think the orchestra that does the prayer. You're going to play the prayer tomorrow.
I'm going to play the prayer.
So you'll hear
It sounds good.
you'll exactly the orchestra because the voice can't sing that damn gruppetto. Now I want to get to that gruppetto in a second. But absolutely a good point. One of the ways in which it's more successful is it has the big tune.
The audience come out humming that tune.
That's right. And by the way, that's one of the ways in which it's better than any opera of Meyerbeer. Because Meyerbeer is good at a lot of things, but he's not good at memorable tunes. And this is, no question, that's a tune that we, actually even two tunes, but let's work with it. What?
It's the love choice.
Yeah, that's memorable. That's memorable. He didn't write it, but it's memorable because not just because the tune actually was. Yeah.
That big tune for Shadows by Dutchman,
Yeah.
it's got that kind of big oompa.
Well, we'll talk. Okay, let's get into that. Just 1 second. I'm gonna actually talk about it. Any more comments on the order? Okay, so I think we kind of agree. Well, the big tune we're talking about is this. Right, that's the big famous tune. Does it remind you of anything else? What about? If I just play, that little term is called a gruppetto, sort of in musical jargon. Wagner loves that. He also, for instance, he does it. Anybody? Well, we have a distraction there in the background. They're eating on during my talk. Time for that another time. What's that from? What's that? Christoph. Okay, so Wagner likes that. He likes that configuration. What's the difference? Why is it so different in Rienzi than it is in any of these other places? It uses a lot of places. But why is it different in Rienzi? In Rienzi, it's a good tune, but it's a very conventional tune. And as soon as notice something else. He does it a lot of ways. He does it faster and he does it martial, but he doesn't change it. It doesn't.
More square.
Yes, it is. Because what is the harmony changes on each part? Yeah, right. I mean, whereas if we take one of the diagram, what's happened to the harmony here? He's kept it on a pedal, like the one I was talking about. This note doesn't change. He does all sorts of things. Opened up. He's taken the corset off. Here, it's being very much defined by the harmonic progression. Yeah. No, I won't allow that because it implies things to classicism that I don't think I can buy. One is conventional, and the other is not. The other is Wagnerian. The tune is Wagnerian.